This is the first video of a three-part series in which we discuss HotDocs parameters and local variables. The first two videos in the series will talk about HotDocs parameters, and then the final video in the series will talk about local variables. If you don't have a programming or technical background, chances are you're not all that familiar with the idea or concept behind a parameter. But all a parameter is a special kind of variable that acts within a model to perform a specific function. In fact, if I were to click on the component manager button here and create, say, a new computation, so I'm just going to go to the computation editor right now, you have models available to you to formulate the script here in your computation. And many of these models have what we've often called placeholders, especially if you've been in one of our live trainings. You'll often hear us refer to these as placeholders, but the num here within parentheses for the absolute value model, for example, is a parameter. We'll actually have a number there and have HotDocs compute an absolute value of that number when all is said and done and things are processed. So if you're familiar with models at all, and you have some prior experience in creating scripts, you do know what parameters are. Well, what we're going to do here is we're going to create our own parameters within script that we develop, and then we'll see how that works, especially here in this first example. So let's go back to the template for a second and look at what we need to do. The template calls for the names of 4 officers of a company. And I'm going to click on the test assemble button here and just show you that I've already created variables to capture this information. And I've created 3 separate variables for each name. So the idea here is that one way or the other, we're going to concatenate or string together the information coming from the interview so that in the output document, for example, the president's name will go here. Now, one conventional way to do this would, of course, be to create separate variable fields for each of those name variables. So we might have first name, middle name, last name variable fields here on each line. And we would probably have if answered logic incorporating that middle name variable just in case it's not answered. An alternative, of course, would be to create a computation concatenating, or again, stringing together each of these names. And we're actually going to take that approach, but we're going to do it with a little bit of a twist so that we can see how we might use parameters in the script that we develop. So I'm going to go back to Component Manager at this point. And I'm going to click on the computation editor that I had open previously, and I am going to create a computation that generically will be called full name, and then I just put a 2-letter type designation there to denote that it's a computation. And I'm going to invoke the space model in concatenating the name information here. So if I go down here to the space model, I can either drag that model up, or it'd be a little quicker to do it this way. I can just type space. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the first name here to represent the first name that will be coming in, or part of the string that we want to produce. Now, normally what I would do, and if I were to do this the traditional way in creating a computation, I might come down here to the president first name text variable, simply drag that up and put a close parenthesis here at the end, and then do the same sort of thing with the middle name and last name. And I could create 4 different computations representing the 4 different officers whose names need to appear in the output document. But instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to this Locals tab. It's called a Locals tab because it does deal with local variables, and as I mentioned, we'll be looking at those in the 3rd video of this sequence, but it also allows you to create parameters. So this is the place in which you create your parameters and local variables as applicable. Well, we want to create a parameter here, and I'm simply going to call it first name. Now I have to tell HotDocs what type of parameter it is. And when I click on the type dropdown, you'll see I have 4 possibilities here. I'm just going to create this parameter as a text variable, or a text parameter, I should say. Now, while I'm here, I'm going to do the same sort of thing for middle name, and this also is going to be a text parameter, and then another parameter representing the last name, and that will also be a text parameter. And then I'm going to come back to the Properties tab, and now I'm simply going to reference the parameter first name that I just created on that Locals tab. And you'll notice when I type it in here, it turns blue and bold. That's an indicator to you here within this script window that this is a valid parameter that you've established, again, on the Locals tab. So I'm just going to put my close paren in here, and then I'm going to go through the rest of the concatenation process, again, using the space model. If you're not familiar with the space model, it puts a space after, in this case, whatever the first name might be, or in this case, whatever the middle name would be. And so I'm going to go ahead and finish creating the middle name reference to the parameter I've created. Again, it turns bold and blue. So there will be a space after the middle name. The other thing the space parameter does, by the way, is if the middle name is not answered, it will not leave a hole in the text string that gets created. It'll just string together, in this case, the first name and the last name. And because the last name we can assume is usually answered, we don't really need to encapsulate that within the space model. We can just refer to the parameter that's been created. So this is going to be a very simple computation variable that concatenates using the space model and, in this case, 3 parameters that we've established, again, on the Locals tab. So I'm going to go ahead and click on OK to finish creating this computation that's going to serve as the foundation for the other computations that I will now create, referencing specifically or concatenating specifically the information for president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer specifically, or respectively. So let's go ahead and I'm going to put my cursor here on the line where I want to create a field now for the president full name computation. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on the variable field button. I'm going to select computation as my variable type. Click on the editor button, and I'll call it president full name CO. Now here, let me go ahead and cancel out of this. Here is where we do something slightly different than what we would normally do. Of course, it would be probably just as easy to create a computation having just those 2 space models and then the last name for each one of these, but that doesn't give us an opportunity to look at how we can leverage parameters. So it might result in the same amount of work either way in this simple example, but in the second video in the series, in example number 2, which you kind of see referred to here below, we'll see how a more sophisticated script really leverages parameters, makes them much more useful, makes us much more efficient in our template development. So rather than come in here and just type in the space model and reference the president first name, middle name, and last name variables, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag up this full name computation that I just created, the one that has the parameters in it. So I see it listed here in the list of available components. I'm going to pull it up, drag it, and drop it into my script. You'll notice not only does the name of the computation variable appear in the script, but after the name, you see parenthetically 3 text, what look like conventional placeholders in already made models. But those 3 placeholders are, of course, the parameters that represent the first name, middle name, and last name as referenced in the computation. So now it's simply a matter of replacing these placeholders or parameters with actual variables. And in this case, because we want to have this computation concatenate or string together the president's name, I'm going to take the president first name variable, drop it on that first placeholder or parameter, middle name on the second, last name on the third. And now when I click on OK and finish creating the field for this computation, puts it right there on the line in which we'd want the president's name to appear. Now I'm just going to go ahead and repeat this process. I'll do it fairly quickly because the process is going to be the same for the other 3. So I'm creating another computation in which I leverage the full name computation containing those parameters. This time I'm going to go down and put the vice president variables there in place of those parameters. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. Do this a couple more times for the secretary and treasurer. Again, leveraging full name with the parameters. Got to make sure I get the right variables here. Okay, notice each time results in a valid text result. And I'll wrap it up here with treasurer. Okay. Now I've created 4 different computations, all based on the one generic full name computation that has parameters. Now, if I were to go through, and I'll just click on update here, and I'll put in some information for all 4 of the officer names. And now if I go to document preview, I see all of those names. Okay. So again, in this particular example, the computation script was short enough in each of these computations that we probably could have just used the space model and essentially recreated the script. But we used parameters in a generic computation and then referenced that computation in each of these computations. The chief advantage to that, and we'll see this hit home a little harder in the second example or the second video of the series, is that if I need to make a change to that script for whatever reason, if I need to do something else within each of these computations, rather than go in and change that script 4 different times, I can just go to the foundation computation, or the generic computation on which all of these are based, and I can make my change here, perhaps adding additional lines of script, making changes, adding new parameters even. And once I do that, those other computations will then use that revised script. So from a maintenance standpoint, from a further development point of view, using a generic computation like this with parameters and then creating other text or other script based on that usually results in greater efficiencies in template development. As I mentioned, we'll see that in action again when we move to the second video in the series, in which we talk a little bit more about parameters and see a more sophisticated example of how you can use parameters in your template development.